Welcome back to the History of the Papacy podcast, a podcast about the popes of Rome and Christian Church. Prepare yourself to step behind the ropes and leave the official tour of the story of the popes and Christianity. I am your host, Steve Guerra, and I thank you for joining me on this journey. Hey, before we get started, I would love to send a very special thanks out to our latest Patreon supporters on patreon.com/history of the papacy. We have Carl, Joe, Jose, and Felix at the Antioch level. Thank you for all of your support. Thank you so much for helping to keep the history of the papacy a going concern. And let's get into it.
Well, Steve, we're on the home stretch in our speculations. Scenario 13. What might have happened if the church had gone down the Marcionite route? Or if you can say the Marcionites would have won. Who are the Marcionites? Fairly early on in church history, round about the year 130, I think, a wealthy guy called Marcion, who was the son of a bishop in Asia Minor, comes to Rome and he basically tries to buy his way into the church. He gives the Roman Church a massive amount of money. I actually did some calculations, and it was like enough money to feed all the Christian poor in Rome for about 3 years on bread. But he starts coming up with ideas which the Roman Church thinks are decidedly off. So Marcion's in Rome, and he starts preaching things which the Roman Church become incredibly dubious about. Basically, what Marcion says is that we don't need all these Jewish books. We're not some offshoot of Judaism. Christianity is its own religion. This is at a time when the canon is basically beginning to form. The Gospels have been written, so a lot of people know about the Gospels. A lot of people know about the letters of Paul, but not necessarily everyone knows about all those things. But Marcion says, no, I'm going to ditch the entire Old Testament. Here's my canon. And he's the first person in Christianity to explicitly create a canon. And his canon is, from what we can gather, it's a sort of a shortened version of the book of Luke and all the letters of Paul that Marcion knows about. He redacts them too to remove sort of Jewish influences. The Roman Jesus Club basically said, no, this is all wrong. Our roots are in Judaism. They boot him out of the city, in effect. They return his money, and I'm sure that was hard to do because it was a lot of money. Marcion goes back to Asia Minor, and he invents his own parallel church, basically. It was never a threat to Christianity. It just didn't really take off. But had Marcion succeeded in persuading the Roman Jesus Club of ditching Judaism, well, that entire link is cut. And Christianity then becomes its own unique religion. And I'm sure, given that all this is happening around about the year 130, by around the year 200, Christianity would have forgotten entirely about its Jewish roots. Our hero happened to have been born in Judea, but it would have regarded that as important as had he been born in Hispania or Gallia. Now, Steve, do you think that Marcionism had a chance of becoming the orthodoxy? I think that's the major question. Did it have a chance?
I don't think it had the chance to be the major orthodoxy. It just seemed that was just a bridge too far because most of the people really were Jewish or were attracted to the religion because of that Jewish element. And to just completely cut that out would be, I think that just would be too much. And that I think that it would have watered down the religion too much. It would have really felt, I think, for most people back then, yet he was inventing something brand new, which they were not big fans of brand new.
Yeah, the Romans really didn't like brand new. To them, that was a superstition, as opposed to a religio. The Romans loved, say, Egyptian religions, even Judaism, were honoured as being ancient. But this new stuff that you guys are thinking up,
Garry and I were talking about Dutch influences on English. It could be poppycock.
Poppycock.
Which is interesting that it's much more popular in Britain to say something's poppycock, but it actually came through the Dutch in America.
Oh.
And then made the leap over to British English, which is unusual at that time. But that's a whole different story for a different day.
Poppycock does sound like one of those quintessential British expressions. Poppycock, old chap, poppycock. Spoken by a middle-aged retired colonel.
With the big handlebar mustache.
And preferably one of those pith helmets. I've actually got a pith helmet.
Well, maybe we'll have to have that in the show thumbnail, you wearing the pith helmet. With Marcionism, maybe as an alternative to it becoming the orthodoxy, I wonder if it really caught hold in Rome, let's say, and maybe it wasn't revolutionary. It just slowly over time, the Jewishness of Christianity faded away. And this idea that the God, the Hebrew God, the God of Israel was the demiurge, and that Jesus is the real manifestation, and eons and all that stuff, that they go into that direction maybe over 50 years. And it causes a multipolar Christianity where in the West, people are more towards this non-Jewish version. And that almost maybe becomes a rump version of Christianity, because that could have split the Roman Empire earlier. Or what does Constantine take up?
There could have been a much earlier cleavage between the Latin-speaking and the Greek-speaking parts of Christianity, which didn't really completely separate until, 1100 or something in the early...
Yeah. Or even as another alternative, that Marcionism vibe stuck in Rome. Even if Rome stays nominally orthodox, there's always it's stuck in people's craw that Rome just isn't right, heresy-wise, and the bishop of Rome doesn't accumulate that power because people just don't respect Rome. Rome. There they go again.
Now, that's a possibility. And you could have had the bishops or the patriarchs of Alexandria and Antioch becoming the big guys until Constantine, of course, builds Istanbul, Constantinople.
Yeah, there's a lot of possibilities, I think, with that. And I think that's another one where it's maybe the alternative history that Marcionism doesn't take over in Rome. You have to be pretty strong in your convictions to give back that much money.
An amazing act of altruism. The Roman clubs must have found his views really quite repugnant. But just further to your bit about, say, Rome goes that way, I suppose they could have then started to regard the Old Testament a bit like most Christians regard the apocryphal books today. There's 1st and 2nd Maccabees and there's Baruch. I heard about them once.
Steve here. We are a member of the Parthenon Podcast Network, featuring great podcasts like Mark Vinet's History of North America podcast. Go over to parthenonpodcast.com to learn more. And now a quick word from our sponsors.
Now, the next scenario, Steve. The Manicheans take on Christianity. Now, Steve, I'm going to rely a lot on your insights here. What I know is a guy called, is it pronounced Mani?
Take your choice.
Mani was active around about the year 240 in the Sasanian and Sassanid Empire. The year 240 is, if I remember correctly, the time of great political crisis in the Roman Empire, but that's by the by. Mani seems to have viewed himself as the final successor in a long line of prophets, and he regarded himself as a universal messenger designed to replace all other religions. And he recorded his teachings in writings. The religion he founded seems to have been a real octopus. It just sucked in everything that it could find. Bits of Christianity, bits of, Zoroastrianism, bits of Gnosticism. And the Manichaean church was dedicated to vigorous missionary activity, like the Christian church was. Manichaeism seems to have been really quite successful, and it spread throughout all the Aramaic-speaking regions of the Near East. So it spreads out from the Sassanid Empire into parts of the Roman Empire, and it seems to have been very popular. And it doesn't seem to have really collapsed until the spread of Islam in the, 600s, was it?
Yeah, late 600s.
So I think Manichaeanism could have posed a real threat to Christianity, and one could have absorbed the other. I mean, maybe the Manichaeanism could have sucked up Christianity, blip, or maybe even vice versa. Christianity could have absorbed a lot of Manichaean elements like Zoroastrianism and that sort of thing. Now, firstly, do you think that Manichaeanism was really a bigger threat?
I don't know if it was a threat per se. That's really in the time in the Roman Empire where they were going towards making Christianity the official religion. And then by the time of Theodosius, the only religion. I think you could maybe make the case that it's almost like, what do they say? Non-African humans have a certain percentage of Neanderthal DNA in them. But I think that you could make the case with Augustine, St. Augustine, or Augustine if you prefer, having been a Manichean during a really pivotal part of his life.
Yeah.
There's some ideas that have snuck into Augustine, and probably it was in his religious DNA, this idea of dualism. And that snuck into his writing. And you could almost say that certain strains of Christianity today have a little Manichaeanism. That might be a controversial opinion, but I'd love to hear what people have to say about that. I think you could maybe make that case.
You could say that the alternative timeline actually did happen, and Christianity absorbed elements of Manichaeanism. So you don't think it's possible that Manichaeanism itself would have triumphed and, say, Constantine or whoever might have made it the state religion instead of Christianity? You don't think that's a goer?
It seems like Manichaeanism wasn't the going concern in around the time of Constantine. I mean, I could be wrong on that. But so even if we put that aside, it seemed like Manichaeanism spread differently than Christianity as well. It was like a wildfire, and it just blasted out, and it almost seemed like it couldn't maintain that rate of growth.
So it was a wildfire destined to die in the end. I must admit, had I been alive, say, the 4th century, I would have been very worried about Manichaeanism, because it just does seem to have been this great intellectual. I need a word. I'm sick of using the word octopus, something which sucks in everything.
Black hole.
That's it. Manichaeanism seems to have been a black hole of a religion, which just consumed everything in its path and threatened to dominate the religious universe. And it had the advantage, I suppose, over Christianity in that it wasn't exclusive. I mean, you could be a Manichaean and be something else. But Manichaeanism was so flexible and all-encompassing, being something else almost didn't matter. It was probably already part of Manichaeanism.
Yeah, and I think that's why it spread into India, and it spread into China and even beyond. And sort of in parallel with Christianity, it seemed to have run parallel to Christianity. And it may have really been that when Islam came around, it cut the middle out of it. Almost like with Christianity in those areas of the Middle East that Islam went into, they just didn't have the juice to stick around. Christianity stuck around a little bit more in the Persian Empire. In that time and in that place, if you weren't on top of the social structure, you probably were going to be in pretty big trouble in your long-term outlook.
Unless you adopted the state religion, do you mean?
Yeah, exactly. Like if you weren't the state religion, your days were numbered. Maybe Manichaeanism could have reached a point where it couldn't be stamped out, but Islam, the advent of Islam, I think would have spelled the end of it, because it really did. It cut the middle out of it, and that would be really hard to overcome. Aren't there theories that the Manicheans turned into the Bogomils and some of those odd Gnostic Christian sects that came out of the Eastern European Slavic? I don't know if those are really off the wall theories, but it kind of makes sense.
So I suppose that's entirely possible. And we know what happened to the Cathars and the Bogomils in Europe.
That could be the reverse situation where Manichaeanism, say it does take over the empire and it sucks up a lot of Christianity into it. So it's maybe 60% Christian. It has a very heavy flavor of Christianity, but it's not the whole structure of the Orthodox Church and all the hierarchy that comes with it and all the arguing about fine points of theology. Oh, wait, do you have a moment? A great way to support the History of the Papacy podcast is by joining us on Patreon at patreon.com/history of the papacy. Your support on Patreon goes such a long way to help keep the History of the Papacy sustainable and on the air for a long time in the future. There are 4 tiers of support on Patreon: Antioch, Alexandria, Constantinople, and Rome. Each of these tiers represents one of the traditional patriarchates of early Christianity. There are many great benefits to you for supporting the show on Patreon. You will receive early and advertisement-free content, bonus episodes, monthly book drawings, and most importantly, you will be included on the History of the Papacy diptychs. In traditional Christianity, the diptychs are the lists of bishops commemorated in the order of their precedence. The sooner you sign up on Patreon, the higher you will be on the lists of the History of the Papacy patrons. Now, here's a brief message from our sponsors.
Okay, finally, Steve. We know that Constantine legalized Christianity. It's not entirely clear whether he himself was a Christian. I mean, because he only got baptized on his deathbed, didn't he? Which seems a little bit of a cop-out. About 2 generations later, it went to the state by Theodosius, who basically said, okay, everyone's a Christian now, whether you like it or not. So the state supported and promoted the organized structure of the church. It gave it money, it gave it protection. Would Christianity have succeeded, prospered, and carried on had that not happened?
That's an interesting one, because then we have a Roman Empire that's a pluralistic society where you can be who you want to be. And I wonder how that would look practically in a situation, because even during that time period between Constantine legalizing Christianity and giving it a boost, maybe not the official religion, but the preferred religion, to Theodosius, that it becomes the official religion, Christianity's still the preferred religion in there. And then you have that oddball time period with Julian the Apostate, and that doesn't really take off. I think Christianity would have stayed around for sure. And I think that it probably would have been the preferred religion because most of the emperors were Christian, and Christianity had really sunk such deep roots, especially in the East. It might have been a different situation in the West, though. Maybe you do have a situation where the people, probably Saul Invictus, would have risen to the top.
That's true.
And you have a situation, you could be a Saul Invictus person, you could be a Christian, and maybe they syncretize together, or maybe they have the battles between each other.
And actually, just speaking of the West, I wonder what would have happened then with the barbarian invasion. Now, Steve, I just know you're going to talk about Arianism. What exactly is Arianism?
It's funny you should ask. That's the brand name, you might say, for a position that was called, more properly, it's called subordinationism. It's a Christological discussion of where does Jesus sit in the Trinity. The Arians would say that, or the subordinationists, it's that Jesus is not God. Now, there's a spectrum. Is Jesus the very best human being that's ever been, sort of an archetypal human being, a perfect human being? These are ideas that go back all the way to the very beginning of the Christian movement. Is Jesus a perfect human being? Sort of almost the Jewish view, you might say, all the way to that he was just a manifestation of God. What the subordinationists would say is, yes, Jesus was an actual person who lived in time. He's something less than God the Father. And there's offshoots, too, about where the Holy Spirit fits in there, that's basically God the Father, Jesus, the Holy Spirit. What they would say is that you can go down a real philosophical and theological rabbit hole of how Jesus emanates from God the Father and all that stuff. Some people will say that, for example, the Gospel of John has Arian elements to it, or subordinationist elements. Well, how it gets that name Arian is that there was a priest of Alexandria. His name was Arius, and he was sort of the spokesman for Arianism. He wrote hymns that sailors would pick up. From what I've read, is that they were almost like Roman sea shanties, and sailors would sing them. Interestingly enough, a lot of the Goths, the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths were Christian already. They were Arians before they had conquered Rome.
Oh, I didn't know that, really.
They had been converted when they lived north of the Danube in sort of the modern-day Bulgaria region. A lot of them had been converted to Arian Christianity through the Byzantine Empire. But it was sort of a soft Arianism, you might say. Jesus was something more than human, but less than divine, to split theological hairs even more. So I wonder if they would have come in and maybe had an easier time converting people in the West to Arianism as opposed to it wouldn't be proto-Orthodoxy, it'd be Orthodoxy at that point. Maybe it would have been easier for them to have converted where the Christians already there were in this struggle with the Sol Invictus people or whoever is the pagan that rises to the top. And the Franks maybe don't become Catholic or Orthodox. They become Arian.
Now, the scenario you're painting is basically that the Roman West stays a plurality of religions, but it may have been converted to Christianity by the barbarians.
That'd be an interesting thing to see.
Geez, that's a weird thing to think about, that it could have happened in reverse.
Now, here's stretching that timeline out a little bit more. I think the true counterfactual historians would be give us a slap on the wrist on this one. Think about the Vandals took over North Africa, and they were a little bit more serious about their Arianism than the Visigoths who had settled in Spain. And the Visigoths, when the armies of Islam came through, a lot of the Vandal aristocracy converted to Islam because their version of Christianity wasn't too far, or at least that's one theory, is that their version of Arianism, it was at least compatible with Islam. So why not join the winning team, basically? If you look at the way Islam spread into Spain or Hispania at that time, it still had a lot of holdouts of Arianism, even though the Visigoths had adopted Orthodox Catholic Christianity. But then a lot of with Islam is they would absorb the aristocratic class, and then you bring the people along. We've talked about that in previous speculations episodes, where people converting to a religion oftentimes wasn't a personal decision. It was if the pater familias made the decision to convert, then the whole family and had a much broader sense of slaves and clients and people on down the line. But in Egypt, and then when they started to get into northern Spain and then southern France, those two places were much more Trinitarian, southern France, northern Spain. So their conviction held them against the Muslims. And if you look, that's kind of where the spread of Islam stopped. And then pockets of the Middle East where Christianity stuck around for much longer than you think should ever stick around is because they were much more Trinitarian and their convictions didn't allow them to convert to Islam. So with the Islam, I think that could have been an outcome, at least in the West, of Christianity not becoming the state religion. I think in the East, Christianity probably would have become the state religion by default. Just through inertia, Christianity, I think, would have become the state religion in the eastern part of the empire just because it was so much more Christian. I think in the West, I think you could have really seen a plurality of religion and then maybe Islam taking over a lot more of Western Europe than it did.
True, but that is a fascinating speculation. Okay, Steve, that wraps up our speculations. Thanks for joining me.
Oh, thank you, Gary. It's been a blast to talk about these things. It's rare you get to just go off on a speculation.
And you don't need any academic credentials to do it.
No, we're all speculators. We all have the ability and the right, dare say, God-given right to speculate. Hey, before we go, let us commemorate the Patreon patrons on the history of the papacy diptychs. We have, at the Alexandria level, Roberto, William B., Brian, Christina, Augustus, Judy, and Max. At the Constantinople level, we have Dapo, Paul, Justin, Lana, John, and Sean, all of whom are magnificent and reaching that ultimate power and prestige. That of the See of Rome, we have Peter the Great, Amma the Great, Geoffrey the Great, Frederick the Great, and Jim the Great. With that, I hope you enjoy this next piece of the mosaic of the history of the popes of Rome and Christian Church.